Hi, well, thank you very much for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about love and leniency, and in particular, I will be talking about the role that a special kind of leniency that I call attentional leniency plays in loving relationships. So yeah, I think it's helpful to start with an example to get a good idea of the kind of phenomenon that I have in mind. So imagine the sorry, imagine the following scenario. Marge has spent weeks helping her teenage daughter Lisa prepare for an important saxophone recital. So she has arranged her schedule to drive Lisa to extra rehearsals. She has listened patiently to the same pieces being practiced over and over again. And she has spent the day of the recital trying to help calm Lisa's nerves. And they're now at the recital, and everything goes well. And as soon as the recital ends, Lisa rushes off to celebrate with her friends. So she chats with them excitedly, they take pictures, and ultimately, Lisa leaves the venue without thanking Marge, her mom, for any of the support that she has received. So I think that by any ordinary standards, it should be quite controversial that Lisa has fallen short of those standards. And it's quite important here that the audience is on board with this idea that Lisa has behaved wrongfully. So, of course, the wrong is probably not very serious. And we may even think that Lisa is excused, for example. But it remains that she has behaved at least somewhat wrongfully by failing to thank her mom. So now there are many different things that Marge could think in response to this. So first, she could think, "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. After everything I did for her, she runs away without thanking me." Or she could think, "What an ungrateful child." Or alternatively, she could think, "Well, it would have been nice of Lisa to thank me, but I guess this kind of behavior is just part of growing up." Um, but instead, actually, Marge does not think any of these things. Um, and rather, her attention is kind of drawn entirely to Lisa's happiness and relief. What she sees is her daughter, who had been anxious for weeks, finally enjoying herself. And so the question of whether Lisa adequately acknowledged her efforts just simply never occupies Marge's mind. So I think that intuitively there is something valuable about this way of responding. And in this talk, I want to argue that part of what makes Margie's response valuable and in fact loving is the fact that she does not pay attention to Lisa's wrongdoing. So it's her display of what I call attentional leniency. So before I go on, I think it's probably useful to say something about the background of this paper, or at least the kind of literature that I was reading when I started to think about this topic. So I think it's sometimes helpful to know where people's views are coming from. So there is, as some of you may know, there is this lively literature on the role that moral obligations play in our relationships. Um, so it's argued, for example, that obligations and associated accountability practices, like blame, for example, are partly constitutive of the value of our personal relationships. So more simply, people argue that part of what makes our personal relationships valuable is the fact that they generate certain obligations, as well as making it fitting to respond in certain ways. For example, with anger, resentment, or indignation when these obligations are breached. And so intuitively, this seems right. And in fact, I'm on board with the idea that our relationships would be lacking in value if they didn't, as people sometimes say, alter the normative landscape in any way. So, for example, if the fact that I'm your friend made no difference to what I owe you, I think our friendship would not have as much value, or at least it would be more shallow than we normally think friendships are. So my purpose in this paper is not to reject this idea. Instead, what I want to do is to kind of call attention to the fact that if we focus too much on the normative dimension of our personal relationships, then we risk overlooking a simple but actually really important fact that cases like Lisa and Marge's bring to light. And this is that regardless of the value we assign to the obligations that bind our close ones to us, we don't always have our eyes on these obligations. So we're not perfect systematic wrong trackers, and nor should we be. Sometimes our close ones fail to be kind to us or to help us or acknowledge our efforts. And yet, like Marge, we take no notes of these failings. And I think, really importantly, this is a good thing about us. So to love others well, we must sometimes be attentionally lenient towards them. So that's the really the basic idea behind this talk and also my paper. So in the talk, I will proceed like this. So first, I want to say a bit more about attentional leniency, and then and what I take it to be. Um, then I will argue that attentional leniency is part of love, and in particular, that it's part of our loving others well, that we don't always pay attention to what they owe us, and so that's as a result we sometimes take no note of the fact that they have breached their obligation towards us. And in the last part of the talk, I will show how once we recognize the importance that attentional leniency has in loving relationships, we realize that there is an issue, namely that there are certain people for whom loving is much riskier than it is for other people. So yeah, that's the structure of the talk. So first, I think in order to show what attentional leniency is, I want to show that the accounts of different normative phenomena that already exist in the literature don't fully capture or they don't fully describe Marge's response, which is my way of saying that attentional leniency is different or it cannot be, is different from or it cannot be subsumed under different phenomena that have already been, different phenomena that have already been discussed. So the first phenomenon is preemptive forgiveness. Um, so to preemptively forgive someone is to decide to forswear or to give up, kind of surrender certain negative attitudes like anger or frustration that would have been warranted in light of their wrongful behavior. So I think kind of this is not an adequate way to describe Marge's response to Lisa's failing, because if what Marge had done was preemptively forgiven Lisa, she could have said something like, well, Lisa should have thanked me, but for example, it's her big day, so I'll let it slide, or as opposed to getting angry, for example, or whatever other reaction you think would have been warranted. So there is a difference between the way in which Marge actually responded and this how she would have responded if what she had done was to preemptively forgive Lisa. Another possibility that may come to mind is epistemic partiality. So the idea in discussions of epistemic partiality is that we often form better or more positive beliefs about our loved ones than what would have been warranted by the evidence that we have at our disposal. Or on the flip side, we often refrain from forming negative beliefs about our loved ones, even though these beliefs would be warranted by the evidence that we have at our disposal. So Sarah Stroud, for example, expresses this idea by saying that where our loved ones are concerned, or in particular our friends, which is what she's concerned with, we become spin doctors. So if the case that we started with was a display of epistemic partiality, then we could expect Marge to form one of the following beliefs. She could think something like, come to think of it, Lisa's smile and excitement are themselves a kind of thank you. Or alternatively, she could think, well, I'm sure Lisa wanted to come here and thank me, but she probably just felt compelled to go with her friends. And so that would have been kind of going beyond the evidence that Marge had at her disposal. And again, it may well be that this kind of responses would have been valuable in some way, but what's important is that they seem different from the way in which Marge actually responded. So she wasn't just kind of epistemically partial. There is something more that went on. One last similar but also not identical phenomenon is suspension of judgment. So in this case, if Marge had simply suspended her judgment, that is, so sometimes people define suspension of judgment as intentionally omitting to form a moral judgment about a given behavior. She could have said something like, well, I'm just not really sure whether Lisa did anything wrong by failing to thank me or something like this. And again, this is different from how she actually responded. So yeah, so it's not the case that what Marge did was to preemptively forgive Lisa. It's also not the case that she was simply partial in how she answered the question of whether Lisa acted wrongfully. And it's also not quite right to say that she refused to answer this question. Instead, what happened is that Marge simply did not think about this question at all. So this way of responding involves something different, I think, from the kind of phenomena that have already been discussed in the literature. And I say that it involves a display of attentional leniency. And I define attentional leniency as follows. It's just a very simple definition. Marge is attentionally lenient in this case, insofar as she just doesn't attend to Lisa's potential wrongdoing. So here you may note that actually this description of the case is compatible with two different states of affairs or two different mental states. So first, when I say that Marge, when I say that Marge does not attend to Lisa's potential wrongdoing, I could be saying that she's aware of it, but she just doesn't pay attention to it. Just like we can be, for example, aware of the mess on our desk without paying attention to it, to borrow Bomarito's example. Or I could be saying that she's just really completely oblivious to the fact that Lisa failed to thank her. But perhaps unsatisfyingly, I think this is an unavoidable ambiguity because the phenomenon I'm attempting to pin down, attentional leniency, is elusive, I think. And so any description of what actually happens in Marge's mind that is kind of more precise than this is going to be artificial. But it doesn't matter. Really, what matters is that when Lisa fails to thank Marge, Marge does not think about herself as kind of the potential recipient of Lisa's gratitude. She only thinks about Lisa's happiness and her relief and so on. And hopefully this is sufficient to get a clear enough idea of the kind of phenomenon I'm interested in when I talk about attentional leniency. Okay, so I have now defined attentional leniency. What I want to do next is to explain why attentional leniency is part of love. But first, I want to make an important clarification that maybe could have been made earlier. And this is that I'm focusing here in the presentation and also in the paper on cases in which people are attentionally lenient with respect to wrongs that others have committed against them, not with respect to wrongs that others have committed with respect to third parties. So when I say that, and when I will be saying that attentional leniency is part of love, what I mean is that it's part of loving others, that we are less than perfectly attentive to their obligation towards us, and thus to the question of whether they have fulfilled or breached these obligations. This should become clear, hopefully, but it's an important clarification, in part because people have more discretion over the judgment and sanctioning of wrongs when they are themselves the victim of those wrongs. And so to talk about the permissibility or desirability of attentional leniency with respect to wrongs committed against third parties, we would need to bring in additional considerations. So here I'm just focusing on cases in which people don't pay attention to the fact that they potentially have been wronged by their loved ones. Okay, so a natural way to understand why cases like Marge and Lisa's strike us as kind of loving, and in fact paradigmatically loving, is by thinking about the connection between love and selflessness. So it's often argued that true love, true love is that which takes us out of ourselves. So when we love someone or when we truly love someone, the thought is our attention kind of ceases to be organized primarily around our interests, our needs, or our entitlements, and instead the interests and well-being of the person whom we love come to occupy the center stage of our attention. So as Whiting puts it, love disposes us to abandon the point of view of prudence or self-interest altogether. So of course, this doesn't mean that loving people never care about themselves, but it means that when people love, there are moments where their concerns for the loved ones become prominent, and that kind of automatically pushes their self-regarding concerns to the periphery of their attention. So that's not kind of a complete account of love, but it's something that is commonly accepted to be part of love. So I think given this, it's quite easy to see why Marge's response strikes us as paradigmatically loving. Because in our example, Marge's attention is directed exclusively towards Lisa's happiness and relief after the concert. So what she sees in this case is her daughter, who had been anxious for weeks, just finally enjoying herself. Lisa and Lisa's well-being are what occupy the center stage of Marge's attention, and that sort of naturally pushes Marge herself and yeah to the background. Um, and it is because Marge's attention is focused on Lisa rather than on herself that the question of whether Lisa has adequately acknowledged her efforts never becomes salient to her. And it's because of this that she therefore is attentionally lenient. So more generally, for people to take note of all the instances in which others fall short of fulfilling their obligation towards them, it would need to be the case that people always remain in their own mental picture, that they kind of always keep an eye on themselves or on their entitlements. Um, but to love others is kind of precisely involves, among other things, sometimes forgetting about oneself and dropping out of one's mental picture. So we can say that attentional leniency is central to loving relationships because central to love are precisely the kind of concerns and motivations that sometimes drive people's attention away from themselves and therefore away from the question of whether those whom they love have fulfilled their obligations towards them. But so to be clear, this doesn't mean that there are no limits to the value of attentional leniency in love. And of course, in fact, on the contrary, I think that someone who was always lenient, um, attentionally lenient with respect to the wrongs committed by their loved one against them, someone who never thought about how they are affected by the behavior of their loved one, um, would not strike us as kind of unambiguously loving. Um, in part because they would probably reveal a form of independence from their loved ones that is commonly thought to be at odds with love. This is especially the case if you take seriously the idea defended, for example, by people like Monique Wanderley, that loving people also involves needing them. So yeah, I'm not saying that there is no tension between love and attentional leniency, at least in the extreme. And in fact, I've been kind of independently interested in this tension, and I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. But the point is that love is at least incompatible with the absence of attentional leniency. It's incompatible with perfect systematic wrong tracking. Okay, so once we recognize the importance of attentional leniency in loving relationships, we also realize that there is quite a serious issue, which is that there are people for whom loving is much riskier than it is for other people. And to see this, let's consider a different example. So, imagine this. One evening, Marge's husband Homer watches a football game in which his favorite team is playing. And by the end of the game, the living room is littered with empty bottles, snacks, wrappers, dirty plates, all of this. And yet Homer goes to bed without cleaning up. And now we can imagine that his wife Marge tidies the living room up before going to bed herself. Um, and now imagine, so it's now the next morning, and Homer comes into the kitchen and he immediately starts talking about the game. He tells Marge all about the goals and how well his team played and so on. And crucially, he says nothing about the fact that Marge has cleaned up the mess that he left behind. So, like before, there are many different things that Marge could think to herself. She could think how rude, the least he could do is, acknowledge that I cleaned up after him. Or she could think, well, he could have thanked me, but it's okay. He's usually grateful, so I'll just let this slide or something like this. But instead of thinking all of this, Marge's attention is just drawn to Homer's enthusiasm. So she just kind of starts to listen to his account of the game. She asks him questions about the rest of the game and how the competition is going to go on, and she just kind of shares his excitement. And the fact that Homer has failed to acknowledge her efforts doesn't at all occupy Marge's mind. So again, she displays attentional leniency. And like before, I think that In doing so, Marge manifests something loving about herself. But I also think that this scenario raises a few worries, potentially. And it raises a few worries, in particular, if we further assume, which I think we most of us do automatically, perhaps given kind of societal circumstances, that the division of domestic labor is at Marge's and Homer is unjust, in Marge's disfavor, and that this injustice is not really salient to Homer. In this case, Marge's attentional leniency starts to come with risks. It starts to become risky. Because by being attentionally lenient, Marge risks kind of entrenching the inequality of the division of labor between her and Homer. And she risks kind of further rendering more invisible both her work, her domestic work, and the injustice of the situation. Um, yes, and as a consequence of not attending to Homer's failure, Marge is also missing out on an opportunity to draw his attention to a behavior that perhaps Homer does not think of as wrongful in the first place. So to be clear, the issue in this example, how I'm thinking of it, is not that Homer doesn't care about Marge, or that he doesn't have her best interest at heart, and that he kind of knowingly kind of violates her entitlement to a fair division of domestic labor. Yeah. The issue instead is twofold. So first, at the moment, Homer isn't really aware of the fact that the present situation is unjust, and that it infringes upon the entitlement of Marge. And second, and really importantly, Homer is unlikely to recognize the injustice of the present situation unless Marge herself draws his attention to it. So, or at least this is the case if we further assume that Marge and Homer live in a society in which women's entitlement to a fair division of domestic labor is not really well recognized. So it's not the case that Homer is going to walk around and see banners that kind of call his attention to the fact that women are entitled to have kind of free time to socialize and so on. It really falls onto Marge in this situation to fix the injustice. So in this case, even though she may not really be aware of it, Marge finds herself in a situation where she's forced to choose between being attentionally lenient and thus loving towards Homer, or remedying the injustice of her situation, both by attending to this injustice herself and by drawing Homer's attention to it. So, of course, this is kind of just one example, but what I'm trying to get at is something more general. Um, and this is that some people, often because of the unjust kind of social structures in which they find themselves, they have no one but themselves to keep an eye on their entitlements or on what they are owed, even if they're loved. So that's not necessarily incompatible. And this is because their entitlements are kind of insufficiently recognized or protected in the societies in which they find themselves. So this is the case for women in patriarchal societies, but it's also the case for kind of many other marginalized individuals. So for these individuals, it is particularly risky to be inattentive to themselves and to what they're owed. It's particularly risky to be attentionally lenient. So here I think there are kind of two options that we face once we recognize this. The first would be to simply deny that where attentional leniency comes with such risks, it is nonetheless loving, or at least it's kind of nonetheless demanded by love. So we could just kind of conclude, well, love makes different kinds of demands on different people depending upon their situation. Another possibility is to accept that kind of even in such cases, being attentionally lenient is loving and perhaps is even demanded by love. And acknowledge the problem that follows, which is that being loving is simply much riskier for some people than it is for others. So I think that possibly the first option holds some truth in that it may be that some of the demands of love are conditional on certain circumstances obtaining, but I really think that it's the second route that we should pursue, and this is because I think kind of many people agree, and it seems rather kind of consensual that loving others requires making oneself vulnerable to them in many different ways. And it also seems kind of consensual that given this, the risks posed by love are going to be much more serious when the individuals who face them are in a precarious situation to start with. So I think that rather than denying kind of the fact that love is risky, we should think about ways in which we can render love less risky, especially for those who are most vulnerable, and so for those for whom it's riskiest. So how exactly we're to do this is, I think, something that requires further reflection, and I'm not able to kind of answer this in the talk or even in the paper. But I think at least one conclusion that we can draw from this talk is that we should work towards ensuring that everyone's interests are well recognized and protected. So if another way to put this is that if love requires forgetting about oneself and what one is owed, then we should work towards ensuring that everyone is provided with the conditions to be able to forget themselves in this way, as well as their entitlements without being forgotten. Um, okay, so, oops, okay. Yeah, so the conclusion is basically that in focusing on the value of obligations and associated accountability practices like blame, for example, I think that the literature on personal relationships has overlooked a very simple but quite important fact, which is that as relationship participants, we are imperfect trackers of each other's moral obligations. So sometimes our loved ones breach their obligation towards us. They fall short of behaving as they ought to, and we don't notice this or we don't attend to it. And really crucially, this is a good thing about it. So our relationships would be they would be in some respect defective if we were perfect, systematic wrong trackers. But of course, recognizing the centrality of attentional leniency in love has shed light on a worrisome issue, which is that there are certain people for whom being loving is just really risky. Um, and yeah, and I think this ought to be remedied. Thank you.